This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.
It's 11:07 at WPSL 1590, the talk of the Treasure Coast. You're on Ask a Rabbi.
And this is Rabbi Shafir Lobb from Congregation Eitz Chaim, your Jewish home on the Treasure Coast. And I don't have my headset on yet. Okay. So I can't hear everything. There we go. That sounds better. So anyway, happy Hoshana Rabbah, everybody.
Huh?
This is another Jewish holiday, Hoshana Rabbah.
You have holidays every week.
Oh, this month, the month of Tishrei, and we're not quite done with Tishrei yet. It's getting closer. We're in the 20s of Tishrei, and that's a good thing because that means it's soon going to be over. And the wonderful month of Cheshvan, which is called Pur Cheshvan, because it doesn't have any holidays. And the average rabbi is beginning to think about smiling because we've only got this Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah to get through this week. And then we're in good shape.
Okay.
So, and obviously COVID has got its big impacts on that because typically, today is a day where you run around and people would have gone in the ancient days through Jerusalem and, Hoshana. It's the save us from ourselves kind of day. And
but large crowds.
But large crowds.
Very large
crowds.
Yeah,
it would have been, this was, Talmud says of Sukkot, which is the holiday that's just ending, Hoshana Rabbah's the last day of it, that if you have not been in Jerusalem during Sukkot, you have never been to a party. Okay, so I mean that that gives you an idea of what it was. And part of, there's a couple of reasons for that. One of which was the immense amount of drinking that went on.
Even back then?
Back then, definitely. So they would spend...
Shocked.
Yeah. According to Talmud describes the holiday in quite a bit of detail because most of Talmud is written after the destruction of the temple. And they would talk about... The rabbis would complain that they got no sleep whatsoever during the holidays. Why? Because they spent the day in study and prayer, and at night they would go to the pools of Solomon where there were giant oil lamps that could light up the courtyard to the point where you could recognize a friend and even read. They talk about how bright it was. And it was said that the priests would take their linen from the previous year that they were no longer using because they started fresh every year at New Year, with fresh clothes, that they would take that, the old linen, and use it for the wicks for these giant oil lamps. So you can imagine that there had to have been a really good amount of light going on. And what would they do all night? They would they would collect water in jugs and whatever else they had. And because the sweetest water in Jerusalem still today is from Solomon's pools. Unfortunately, some of it came through Roman pipes after the Romans came through Jerusalem, but that's a whole different story. It still got very sweet water.
Okay.
And so they would draw water all night. They had, and there's songs and there's sayings about it, right? The wells of salvation coming up and collecting this water. And it would be taken to the temple, and in the morning it would be poured, you ready for this, into the wine to make it drinkable. Okay, so there would be a jug of wine and a jug of water pouring together, and they talked in great detail about how different the two jugs were. Why? Because the wine jug has to be really a big opening because it's so viscous. The texture of the wine in those days, not what we see today, not what you buy a bottle of Chianti or Sangria or whatever, Merlot or and the names of different wines is quickly fleeting out of my mind.
See, it would be a Catholic ceremony if it was 2 wines in 1 water.
In those days, you couldn't have drunk the wine.
Oh, okay.
And that's the point of it, because it was a very. It would be like trying to drink a container of grape concentrate.
Ooh.
Yeah. Okay. So it'd be that
Well,
sludgy.
even back in the day, back in the 60s and 70s and stuff, I remember I was at a friend's house during High Holy Days, and the Manischewitz that he had at the house was like motor oil.
Yeah. 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 Grape. It's cough syrup.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It is.
It's very reminiscent. It's very, very sweet. It's incredibly sweet. And so being cut, if you'd cut it with fruit juice, it'd be much more drinkable. But even water would probably help.
Wow. Okay.
Okay.
That's interesting.
So
Yeah.
in those days, though, because they didn't filter out the sludge when they made wine, they trampled the grapes and they put them in vats to ferment. But what you got was this sludge, and so you thinned it to make it drinkable. And there's a great big discussion about, and I have no idea what the alcoholic content would have been, but I'm sure it was much higher than today.
I was going to say, it's not like today.
No, it was probably much closer to moonshine. But, right. So you had to cut it in order to make it drinkable. And that's what's going on. There's a ritual of pouring the water into the wine to make it drinkable that's going on in the temple in the mornings. And they're roasting 70 oxen a day. You want to talk about a giant barbecue?
70?
70. That's a requirement of the holiday.
For how many people?
For, everybody's going to get a small bite.
Wow.
Think about that a minute. You don't need much. They ate much less meat than we eat today. And so, it was a giant party throughout the city celebrating a number of things. A good harvest. It's a market kind of situation. There's lots of stuff going on in Jerusalem. It's just very festive, very party-ish. And you don't have to go very far because the booths, the huts, the sukkot are put up all over. And so people are sleeping in these huts. So you don't have to travel home. You don't have to be sober. You can just camp anywhere. Right.
So now the valleys around that area, they're all pretty fertile as far as produce goes, right?
Well, until you get down into the desert parts, yes.
Well, yeah, obviously.
Which is not that far.
Okay.
Okay. It's mountainous. The most fertile part of Israel or back then Israel and Judea, or Galilee and Judea, is Galilee. Galilee is much more fertile. The people are much wealthier. Judea is a fairly poor country because once you get out of the city, once you get down into the desert, this is not a thorn scrub like we had in Tucson, you and I. This is a desert. This is sand. The only place that stuff grows is by oases. And so, yeah.
All of the Sahara.
Yeah. All of the Sahara, right? It's just sand dunes. And it's very, very quiet. It's amazing. There's not a whole lot out there. It's an amazing thing to sit by the side of the road if your car is working and can get you going again. But to sit at the side of the road, turn your car off for a few moments. And I don't know how the traffic is now if you can get that. But that was one of the fun things when I was younger and there, was to be able to do that. Just sit in the desert and just hear the quiet. Amazingly quiet. But
I remember going out to Old Tucson and, at night, and you just look up at the stars. And
yeah, but there you could hear a coyote. Noise. There's coyotes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yes.
Okay, so there is noise.
Well, there is, but animals.
Yeah. Yeah. And Old Tucson is closing.
Yeah, I read that.
Isn't that sad? Old Tucson is going to be gone.
I can't tell you how many stories I did there. Actually, when I was in Los Angeles, we did one of the award winners was a spoof on the Cactus Baseball League, which was all shot at Old Tucson. It was a funny bit, and they had outfitted me and stuff. It was nuts. It was insane, but I love that place, and I read that last week. I thought, oh, no.
Yeah. It's hard, they're dependent on tourism to survive, and it's not been. They don't shoot enough films there anymore.
Oh, no.
First of all, it's a little bit hard. There's far too many cars coming down the pass, and you can't shoot a horse scene with cars in the background. It just doesn't really work.
That's like there was that famous Western former mayor of Carmel. He was in something, and they had this great shot. It was in the desert, supposedly. And you see these power lines going across in the shot, and I'm going, uh-oh. Somebody messed up there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you need to check the scenery and see what else is in the line.
Shot in Simi Valley. Oh, yeah, sure.
So it's another good reason for underground utilities. Keeps the sets more pristine. And the other one that I always love, of course, is pictures of Tombstone that show Saguaro. No, Tombstone's too high.
I was going to say, I've never seen
there's no
there.
Saguaro in Tombstone because the elevation's too high.
Yeah, oh yeah.
So the Saguaro are gone. And
people don't know Tucson's high desert.
Yeah, it's high desert.
Compared to just drive 100 miles up the road and you're in they call it the Valley of the Sun.
Yeah,
which is Phoenix is a valley.
Yeah, it's a valley, and that's why Phoenix is hotter than Tucson is.
10 degrees.
10 degrees typically, 10 sometimes 15.
Yeah.
I can remember driving out of Phoenix and watching the thermostat in the car just go down, and very happy for it. So.
Once you hit Picacho Peak,
it's
then all of a sudden you go up a hill.
Yeah, and we also watched a haboob off in the distance that didn't hit anything big, but it was impressive. We kept hoping, and it didn't, that it wouldn't come across the highway. But what did happen? We were in a convertible. My friend had a convertible, and we were driving home from Phoenix, and we stopped on the I-10, and we're about to get off, and I looked at her and I said, so can we put the roof up while we're waiting at a stoplight? She says, well, it takes X number of seconds. And I said, I think we can do it. And I pushed it, and it started to come up because I was driving. And no sooner the roof went than the heavens opened up, and I looked at her, and she said, yeah, we would have been wet.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, we would have had to pull over somewhere and put the roof up. And this way we did it at a stoplight.
Do you remember Stuckey's?
Yes.
Carol memorized the location of every Stuckey's, I think, in the state of Arizona. It was oh, yeah. Oh, my.
So, anyway, yeah. So those are great, those are great memories. But bringing it back to Jerusalem and to the holiday, Hoshana Rabbah. Hoshana Rabbah is the goodbye to the sukkah. My sukkah just came down minutes before I left to come here. And so it's done. And you normally beat the willows and bring yourself and everything else into some kind of joyful submission. And then tonight, is Shmini Atzeret. We're going to be doing Yeskar this Shabbat tonight at our services on Friday night. And that's a streaming concern. We're bringing it into the evening to make it more accessible for people.
Okay, well that's cool.
Yeah.
Now you had the temple decorated. I saw on Facebook.
The temple was decorated for
that was
Sukkot.
beautiful.
Shout out to Stacy and her crew. She's got 2 wonderful kids. And
that was wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
The whole crew and Fitz with her. Bringing that beauty to it, and it's going to be gone. The holiday's done. And so this year we're going to really try to grow some of the etrog, the fruit, and see if we can't get some young trees going. There are 2 key limes in front of the temple right now that we've planted, and somebody grabbed one of the limes off of it. It was ripe. It was ready. The other one's about ready to come out. There were 2 this year on it. So our little baby trees. Someday they'll be put in the ground. As soon as we have our own property, we'll get them in ground.
There you go.
Pots. Yeah.
Cool.
That's the game plan. And we would have planted another one, but of course COVID came in right before we were going to do that planting, so it never happened this year. Oh, well. Yeah. Such is life.
2021 cannot get here soon
You know,
enough.
I don't think we're going to be through this yet when 2021 gets here.
I think you're right.
You're
right.
Everybody's like, oh, as soon as January hears, everything's going to be fine, and there's going to be this wonderful, miraculous vaccine. I think I hate to say it, but I think that's pie in the sky. I don't really think that's going to happen. It's just there's not enough time. And who wants to, there are people who are willing to be part of the trials. That's the good news. But, yeah.
Well, and, hats off to, of course, you're starting to see him on the newscast all the time, this Fort Pierce doctor, who was one of the people who came up with the cocktail that I guess that they gave the president, and it's working. And apparently it's been used for cancer patients for a long time.
Yeah, there's all kinds of different cocktails, and certainly even the Chinese were working on them. It's in their book, the different cocktails that they tried. We'll see how and where it goes. What can I say?
Yeah, and it's affected everything. It's affected everything.
It has. It absolutely has. And so, we'll see how and where it goes and what's going on.
But I would think that if you had maybe fallen away from, say, a church, no matter what denomination, you might have come back just a little bit after this thing broke out. Is that,
I don't know. I don't think so.
That?
I don't think so.
Really? See, I would think that would be natural, that you would, go back to whatever in the past.
Well, here in Florida, Florida's only got like a 25% affiliation rate. We're really pretty low. So I'm gonna tag along. I'm gonna hitchhike on something that Stuart was talking about on Ask a Lawyer. He kept referring to America as a democracy. Really, we're a constitutional republic. And
that's what his last caller had mentioned. Yeah.
Well, he called it something else, but we're a constitutional republic. We have an electoral college. We do not directly elect our president, and it's only actually fairly recent that we even elect senators. Senators at one time were appointed out of their states, right? Because the model
remember that,
the model. Yeah, well, that's thanks to the corruption discovered in the research on the Titanic. That you didn't want quite that system of government that had those vested interests in deep pockets. I'm trying to say this nicely enough. And so there was a constitutional amendment that changed the way that senators are elected. Unfortunately, in some states, there were still legacies where, it's still today the children of the people who had been appointed. And those groups have not necessarily unhanded the power, for lack of a better way of describing it. And so we still have some vestiges of that system going on. It was modeled after the British House of Commons and the House of Lords. And so it is set up with different groups. But the founding forefathers, and they were men, with whatever influence their wives could put into it, but it was mostly the men that met together and talked. And
what a dull meeting that would have been.
No comment. Oh. Stop it. Now, you don't know what role. I mean, there's some women that certainly were big players in what was going on. It just wasn't the headline stuff. And because you can't.
They couldn't vote back then.
They could not vote. Well, and Stuart brought that up, right? 1964 did not include the vote. The vote didn't come until later. Folks, let's think about that a minute. Just based on a teeny bit of skin color, a teeny bit, a whole big chunk of America couldn't vote. Yeah. That's less than 100 years ago. That's barely over 50 years, folks. That's not that long ago. Women have the vote for about 100 years now, but not if you were black. And, it's pretty scary. And whether or not you were black was as much a function of what state you were from, because the definition was not the same throughout, just as free and slave. Well, let's go back to the slave laws.
Okay.
Okay, so in Virginia, you were the status of your mother. If your mother was a slave, which very often happened when the plantation owner had a side gig. Right.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, there were
It's crystallizing here.
okay, there were children, and those
Yep.
children were slaves because they were born to a slave. In Maryland, you were the status of your father.
Wow.
Okay, so colonies and then states had a lot of control over things like that. Who was free, who was not free, who could own property, who could not own property, who could vote, who could not vote. All of these things were much more localized. And the colonies were very, very different. That was one of the challenges in trying to come together as the United States of America, was to that's what the issues were, was how do we handle these differences in laws between what was local and what was national, because they were very different. Different states had different proper churches or state churches. There were state churches in the beginning, and that's why we have the First Amendment that says Congress shall make no law. It doesn't say anything about states. It isn't until the 14th Amendment where the 14th Amendment gives people equal protection under the law. And when that goes into effect, that's when state churches stop. So were we a Christian country? No, we were a country where the majority of people were Christian. But some states were Christian. Some states, not all. And they were different kinds of Christian.
And then there was Utah that was Mormon.
Well, that's a Christianity. That's a Christianity. Because if you drop the Mormons and you drop the Jehovah's Witness and you drop the Christian Science, you're no longer the largest religion.
Okay, I got you.
If you don't include the groups that are a little more afield, if you don't have the broad field, then you don't have the numbers. Because when you say that Christianity is the largest religion in the world, you have to use the definition that any religion that has to do with the teachings, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is, not the divinity. Notice divinity is missing from that definition. And it's intentionally missing. Right?
Wow.
Because that way,
Okay.
that way you can encompass many more of the Christianities. The religions having to do with Jesus. And it is very carefully crafted. It's very, very carefully crafted to make Christianity the largest religion. So, if you don't want to go with those fringe groups, then you lose the dominance. And then Islam becomes the largest religion, followed by Hinduism. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, those are very diverse. We don't think of Islam as being diverse, but it's extremely diverse. There's many, many different branches. We're familiar with the Sunni and the Shia as the big division, but there's also, Wahhabi's not that old, actually. It's not even on the older charts. And I've got some beautiful, this one came from this one, and I've got that for every religion because I taught religion. But and I'm not teaching it this semester, so I use it in the past tense. I sometimes teach world religions. And it's very diverse too, but it has Jesus in it. Right? Islam teaches that Jesus is the Messiah, sits at the right hand of God to be there for Judgment Day. And they're much more concerned about Yom Din, the Day of Judgment. And one of these times we'll have Muhammad back.
He was great.
He was great. He was
great. Yeah.
So, he and I have to reconnect and have him come back in again and talk a little bit more about it, because he can talk obviously with more authority than I would. But but they teach about Jesus. Jesus is in the Quran. Mary has a mystical birth. It's
in the Quran.
In the Quran, right? The trees bend low so that she doesn't have to stretch to pick the dates.
Wow.
Okay, and all kinds of things happen for her. More so, they've got much more of a story of the birth narrative than Christianity has, because Christianity didn't get around to the birth narrative until later. If you look at the progression of the Gospels, it's not in Mark. You don't get the birth narratives until you get to Luke and John, because they have to expand the narrative in order to. One of the theories is that the Gospels and the Christian scriptures expanded so that there were readings available for the whole year, so that a lectionary could go all year. And so in order to do that, you increase the narrative. And so however it came down. But by the time of the writing of the Quran, which is a few years later, somewhere around 600 of the Common Era, is when Muhammad lived. And by then, there's a distinct Christian story, and there's distinct Christian groups. Certainly much stronger after the 300s with Constantine.
So how many authors of the Quran were there?
In theory?
Yeah, in theory.
In the teachings of Islam, it was dictated to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. In reality, one of his successors started to write it down and codify it. And, sacred story is a very difficult thing. It's just very difficult to parse through. You can look at it academically, and it's very different than what you look at theologically. And in those days, religious leaders did not write down their stuff. They just didn't. Their followers wrote it down, and sometimes it was their followers' followers. And so the stuff goes through some transmissions, and you pick up the stories that people have been repeating. And we're human, and just as newspaper reporters sometimes pick up a little bit of stuff into their stories, everybody has an agenda. And is there sacredness within each? Yes, there's absolutely sacredness within it. Sacred stories are true, but they're true in a different kind of way than a scientific story.
So gospel truth isn't necessarily gospel truth.
Well, the Gospels, sir, contradict each other.
Yes.
Right? That's one of the reasons why for many years people were told, you don't need to read it, we'll read it for you and tell you what's there. Because the opinion was that the average Joe Christian couldn't handle having two different lineages for Jesus. And he's got two different pedigrees depending on which book you're reading.
Yeah.
And that's one of the challenges within Christian scripture. How that didn't get homogenized along the way, I don't know, but it didn't. And there's other stories that have conflicts within it. Did he do this first? Did he do that first? When did he, da-da-da-da-da-da. And so going through some of that stuff is it's interesting, it's fascinating, but they're not in 100% agreement. So I'm not quite sure what gospel truth really means. I mean, I know how it's used in the vernacular, but which truth is true? Okay, so that's where you come to be.
Which book are you reading? Oh.
Yeah, right. And then you've got, of course, just as, and you and Stuart touched on it a little bit last hour, everybody's got an agenda, me included. Everybody's got an agenda. We've all got things that are important to us that we, whether consciously or subconsciously, slant toward. It can be as simple as what's included where and in what way. Right? So, why do these stories get coverage and these other stories not? And one of the answers, very simply, is if it bleeds, it leads, right? An old newspaper.
Oh, yeah.
An old, not just newspaper, but reporting adage, right? If it bleeds, it leads. Why? Because it sells readership. It sells viewers. It collects people. And so if it's sensational, then people will listen to it. It's more interesting.
There used to be a sign at KGO Channel 7 in San Francisco. If it bleeds, it leads, right above Eyewitness News. I'm going, really?
Yeah.
Oh, brother. Yeah.
Well, because it brings people in. People are, watch accidents on the road. The gorier and messier it is, the more the rubberneckers. Yeah.
Yep.
And more the traffic jam and everything else, because people are just drawn to that by some primal concern. What happened here? Where's the gory details, and what happened, and yeah. And so it sells. It sells readership. It sells viewership, which in turn sells advertising dollars. So it's important. Money does control a lot of things. Money influences a lot of things. And so there is a picking and a choosing, and that kind of picking and choosing went on in Sacred Story as well. The stories that people liked and wanted to hear and wanted to repeat are the ones that made it into sacred scripture. That's just the academics of it. And there is picking and choosing. Why is this story here and not the competing story that was slightly different? Well, maybe it didn't, maybe the writing wasn't as good. An example of what doesn't make it into the canon, we're going to be coming in a few months to the story of Hanukkah. Hanukkah's not in Jewish scriptures. The book ends shortly before it. That's an intertestamental book, the Maccabees. The church kept it, and thank you to the church, because without it we wouldn't have had the books of Maccabees. They're not nearly as well written as earlier books.
So when were they written then?
Well, Hanukkah actually occurs after the Bible closes for Judaism. Jewish scriptures ends more with Ezra and Nehemiah, that era. And the story of Hanukkah has to do with the Greeks already. By the time of the Greeks, the books are closed and canonized. The last two books in Jewish scripture are Daniel and Esther. And so we find in Qumran and places like that, where there are going to be fewer copies of those books because they're late. But
so are you talking 100 years?
A few hundred years. Yeah, a couple hundred years.
Wow.
And Hanukkah doesn't happen more than a few hundred years before Jesus. So there's a gap. There's a gap of close to, I want to say 5 to 1,000 years. I'd have to go and really look. I'm talking totally off the top of my head right now, and I'm not looking at anything that I can truly reference. Mm-hmm. But the story of Hanukkah starts with it's closed by the time Alexander comes through. And Alexander the Great, of course, homogenizes, and the historians put it nicely, he mixes up the traditions. Right? He causes some blending in what's going on in his effort to kind of like the Borg. He wants to take what's good and incorporate it, and then evaporate what he doesn't like, what doesn't serve his purposes. And so he
was the Donald Trump of the time.
I'm not going there.
Okay. Sorry.
I try not to do those things.
Sorry.
Even though some readers think that I do, or listeners, I don't. I try not to get all that political. Although I'll leave one question as you go to vote. Please do vote. Let me digress enough to say, please do register. Please do vote. It's very important in our country. We need to hear the voice of who and what Americans really are. And the question that I would ask everybody, when you consider your ballot, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Are you in a better place than you were 4 years ago? And that should help you decide whether to make a change or to stay put. And that's just a simple question, and everybody's got to answer that for themselves. Because it's not what's going to happen 2 years from now or 3 years from now. It's what's happened in the last 4 years. Is it what you wanted? Did everything happen that you were promised? Is your situation better, or is it not? And those are the questions, and each person has to answer them for themselves. I'm not here to answer it for anybody. I'm just here to raise the question.
Well, and you brought up a few times about the money aspect of a lot of things, and I was watching CNBC, and they were talking about the peace treaty. And what they were saying is is in reality that peace treaty with Israel and its Arab neighbors is because there would be less petroleum interests in Saudi Arabia because of changing economics in the world.
Follow the money.
I know you've said it several times.
Follow the money. You know, to me, one of the more interesting things is the potash works between Jordan and Israel. People don't hear about it. There's a potash factory at the base. Potash. It's used in a number of. It's a very important chemical, and there's a factory that collects it at the basin of the Dead Sea. It's a very rich area, collecting the chemicals out of the Dead Sea and maybe even helping to kill the Dead Sea. But that's a whole other story. The Dead Sea's dead, but to dry it up, it's drying up slowly. There's much less of it than there used to be.
So the Dead Sea has some rich land?
It has some chemicals in it.
Oh, here we go.
That are very needed for industry and for technology.
It almost sounds like the rare earth chemicals that are in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, stuff like that.
Okay.
And that factory didn't lose a single day's production just because there were wars in the area.
Oh, God.
So follow the money,
Follow
folks.
the money. Oh,
okay.
My.
You know, and these are not things that they're not publicized. And, you know, we can ask, why are they not publicized? They are recorded in places. You can find them, but you have to do some digging, and most people don't dig. So, yeah. And that's not new. That's always been the case. I can remember distinctly sitting in class, and I think it was an ethics class. I'm trying to remember exactly which class. I think it was ethics. And one of the students saying, you know, why do we have to know these things? Can't we just live day to day and be happy? And it's like, you know, that's a choice. And if that makes you happy to be the blind sheep, you know, then you don't belong in school, because you're going to learn things that are going to upset that apple cart.
It's true.
And, you know, we learn from conflict. We learn from stress. I wish that wasn't the case, but that's what it takes to make most people learn. And so, yeah. You know, I did like that analogy, though, of the caller, that last caller on Stewart, with the two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner. And that was actually one of the things that Socrates said. We want to go back in history, was that a pure democracy is bad for minorities.
Wow.
Because majority
Socrates?
rule. Yeah.
Wow.
Socrates complained about that. That a pure democracy is bully rule by the majority, because the minority doesn't have a voice.
Wow.
And, you know, so the minority opinion, and we do this with our Supreme Court, but it talks about it in Talmud, in the book of Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is the set of Talmudic discussions dealing with courts and laws, and how you try this and how you try that, and how you adjudicate this and how you adjudicate that. And they talk about always needing a minority opinion. So it was recognized, and it's been recognized for a long time.
Thousands of years.
Thousands of years. Yeah, thousands of years. So it's not a new thing. The minority often loses in a majority rule. And yet, how are you going to, you know, how do you balance all of these things? That's the bottom question. How do you balance the needs of the many and the needs of the few? Right? How, you know, we do not have the resources to give everybody the health care that President Trump had in his bout with COVID, or that continues to have.
You mean you don't have 12 doctors?
and nobody's sitting here monitoring your vitals and giving you oxygen at your first shortness of breath. And I'm sure that many of the folks who did die, if they had gotten anything close to that kind of care, wouldn't have. But the reality is that we do not have the resources to give that level of care to everyone. And to pretend that we do is just living in some fantasy land. The resources, we ran out of ventilators, folks. Right? We've had ventilator shortages with this disease. That's probably the worst part of it. It's not that the disease can't be treated. It's that we don't have enough resources to treat everyone who has the severe disease.
All right, you've had pandemics in the past.
Yeah, and people have died because there are not the resources.
But have you ever had a worldwide pandemic like this?
Yeah. The Spanish flu. Wilson, right? Woodrow Wilson was infected because he downplayed it, and when he went to Europe. He caught it in Europe.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
So let's look at history. He downplayed the pandemic as well and said it wasn't a big deal. It was nothing more than a flu. So there have been viruses. And of course, you look back at the Black Plague, the bubonic plague. There are any number of different plagues and diseases that have come through time. They come through infrequently enough that we tend not to follow them well. But anywhere where there's trade, disease follows the trade routes, because that's where people go from place to place to place. And along with trading the carpets and the silks and the etrog, the fruit, and transmitting all of those things, tea and china and porcelain, they bring disease. We brought smallpox to America. Right? And
yeah.
And so today, where you can fly all over, people talk about the travel ban that President Trump instituted. 40,000 people still came into America from China after that travel ban, because it wasn't all as restrictive as it sounded. There's sound bites and then there's reality. Sorry, folks. I know that's kind of
shocking.
Yeah, I know. How can I say that on a radio station? But the reality is that there's always more to the story. There's always a backstory, and there's unintended consequences that go along with it. And so we do have a lot more travel today. We have a ton more travel. People can go anywhere, and they don't have to spend a week on a ship coming from. Right, when my mother of blessed memory came from Europe, she couldn't hop on an airplane and come. She was on a ship. She's on the Rotterdam.
Yeah, I think Carol was on the USS America or something, or SS America, coming from London when she was in Pakistan.
Yeah.
And they had to come over from London to New York. Yeah.
So, so things...
That was a week.
Things traveled, but they also incubated on those ships, right? And people were health checked. It's one of the reasons for Ellis Island was a health check coming into the country. And if you had typhoid or any other communicable disease, you were turned back at Ellis so that you didn't get into the general population. But the other reality of that is, but you infected the worker who then went home.
I was going to say, yeah.
Because we didn't have plexiglass panels and sanitizers and all of these other things. We've got a lot more weapons, if you will, to battle the pandemics and the diseases today than we had 100 years ago. And that's helping. And yet we did not bring to bear anywhere near the kind of resources that a lot of countries did in fighting this pandemic. I was talking with my Chinese students. Even my students knew that China put up field hospitals. They put up hotels, and they did massive testing and isolating of anybody who tested positive, and that's how they shut it down. They shut it down by pulling those people, putting them in those hotels or in the hospitals if they needed the hospital treatment. And they did do a cocktail. I've got the documentation that was given to me by one of my ex-neighbors in Tucson who had been in Wuhan. Wuhan's a big center. It's a big industrial center.
Oh, it's huge, yeah.
We like to think of it as
like
this little back country, but it's not.
It's like 6 or 7 million people.
Yeah, it's huge. And it's got beautiful, beautiful architecture and fancy commercial areas. And but the government came in, and once the cases hit their number, they shut it down, and they shut it down with emphasis. And I would guess that they're kind of amused at what we're doing now, because when somebody came out of the hospital and tested negative, you didn't go back home. You still waited 14 more days in a government hotel. And then you could go home. Right? So you didn't come out of the hospital and a few days later go out, run around.
In your helicopter.
And that's the big difference. And that's part of why they could shut it down as effectively as they did. The combination of limiting the number of people who come in, quarantining the people who come in until they can be sure one way or another, and taking those and doing massive testing and isolating the folks who test positive.
Now, were any of the Chinese kids that you teach, were they affected at all, or their families?
I don't know of anybody who became sick, but one of my students, his mother, went to Wuhan to be a nurse, and he was really, I got interesting conversations with him, and because he would talk to her and then he would tell me a little bit about it, and he was really excited when she was coming home. But she had to wait her quarantine coming home from having been in Wuhan. She had to wait out her quarantine before she was allowed back home.
Wow.
So he had only talked with her and FaceTimed with her and hadn't seen her in months.
Oh, my.
So, and I don't think she made it home, I want to say May, June. I mean, it wasn't early. It was well into,
Yeah, she had to be gone at least 5 months.
Yeah, she was gone a good long time.
Wow.
And she was a healthcare worker. And he was commiserating with me because his best friend's mom also was a healthcare provider. So both of them were without moms for a good chunk of the year. And we don't get that news.
No.
We don't hear those day-to-day, everyday stories of what it was like. And they wear a mask without any, we have some fun times where, I'll show them this mask and they'll show me the 15 different masks that they wear because to them it's a fashion statement. They don't go out without it. And there were pictures just now. They're having a holiday right now. They have Mid-Autumn Festival, and October 1st was National Day. And my husband Bill was commenting that he was looking at pictures of the Great Wall, and it's wall-to-wall tourists, but they're wearing masks. Okay, so there's not social distancing because it's just a mob and it's a festival, but there are masks and other precautions being taken, and they don't have anywhere near the numbers that we have. So it has to do with all kinds of things having to do with trade and quarantining and, how you isolate people, how often you test, who gets tested. Those are big questions. And I would argue that in the U.S. we've not done a good job of testing. And when we test, we tell people, go home and self-isolate. Well, that's wonderful, but how many people really, really do? And what does that mean, self-isolate? Does that mean that I can go in my car wherever I want? Can I share stuff with people? Who comes into my house? Who doesn't come into my house? What if my air conditioner breaks down? If you're quarantining, that would be an oh well, but it's not. People come into your home and do something. Yeah. You don't normally think of an air conditioner mechanic as being on the front lines of this, but they are.
If you're quarantining
If you're
in your house.
quarantining, right, and it was one of the things that Port St. Lucie asked was that if you tested positive, please don't recycle. Right? Because there you're putting your trash out and people have to handle it. Those are things that we don't think about. And of course, the gas stations was another big thing, right? Because if isolated people are traveling, they're putting gas in their car. And they're putting their hands all over the gas station pump.
Sure.
And so, we don't do enough care of cleansing ourselves and the things we touch. So, yeah, there have been plagues for a long, long time. This is just the most recent one, the most recent pandemic. Woodstock happened during a pandemic. How's that for sobering? I have no idea how many cases were contracted at Woodstock. I'm sure that somewhere, I'm sure it was a super spreader event. But
and we knew a lot 9 months after Woodstock, too.
Yeah, there was a whole lot of spreading that went on at Woodstock.
Yes.
And, but we didn't track it the way that that's what's different. We've never tracked a disease the way we've tracked COVID. We've never measured the numbers. I was fascinated closer to the beginning of this with the song, Billy Joe McAllister jumped off of Tallahatchie Bridge.
Yeah.
Right at the end of that song, Bobby Gentry says, there was a virus going around last year. Papa caught it and he died. And Mama doesn't seem to want to do much of anything. It's just a real quick little line in the song. But, that was probably a pandemic she was referencing.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Goes around, comes around. The number of people killed by HIV.
Sure.
Staggering. H1N1.
Yep.
And all of its derivatives. Stay safe, folks. Wear your mask. Wash your hands. Social distance to the best of your ability. Please be careful. You don't know when you're contagious. Be courteous to others. Don't scare everybody else. It's not macho to be. It's macho to be kind. Let me put it that way. It's macho to be considerate. That's human. Be a mensch. Chag Sameach. Happy holidays, everyone. Happy Hoshana Rabbah and happy Shmini Atzeret coming tomorrow. This is Rabbi Shafir Lobb, and this has been Ask a Rabbi.
You've been listening to Ask a Rabbi right here on WPSL, Port St. Lucie. Talk of the Treasure Coast, webcaster to the world. Time now for the Agnet crop forecast for the coming year.